Welcome to another episode of Strategic Thinking and Leading. My name is Timothy Williamson, and I am your host. Our vision is to find, guide, develop, and encourage deep, holistic, and creative strategic thinkers and leaders. First, though, a disclaimer. This is an unclassified discussion. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of any particular organization, ideology, or government. And we're honored to have with us today Dr. Edward Rockower. He's going to discuss thinking about thinking, as you can see on your screen. Doctor, I'll turn it over to you. I'm going to mute my camera on my end. I'll keep my mic open so that you're at the top of the page. It's all yours, sir.
Thank you, Tim. And I hope that this is enjoyable and inspires some discussion. These slides are not meant to be fire and forget. The intent is to foster some meaningful discussion among people who've been thinking for a very long time. Another caveat, I have one caveat here that these are purely my own personal opinions. Another statement might be that it's true that thinking is my vocation, but trying to understand how to think is my avocation. It's been something that I've been interested in for a very, very long time. So with no further ado, whenever I have to think about something, I try to have an organizing principle to hang all of the vast numbers of facts and details and experiences and thoughts. Having an organizing principle is helpful to me because one of my mantras is that I'm easily confused and I forget things. And I think that that's a really good mental stance to take when you're trying to discuss something that is so personal, subjective, and kind of difficult to really understand how it is that we're doing it, which is thinking. So we want to discuss deep strategic thinking, of course. And so, again, trying to go back to being very simple-minded about it, it implies to me some immediate questions. Number one, what is strategic? And I probably won't talk too much about that. What is thinking? And I have some ideas about that, and I've done a lot of study and introspection. And I'd like to put it on the table that it should include intuition, not just left brain logical thinking. What are the types of thinking in addition to strategic thinking? And how do we know that those other types of thinking are not strategic? An important question is, who is it that's doing the thinking? Who is it that is actually the person? So you can't really talk about thinking or the rules of thinking or the types of thinking without considering who it is that's the actor, the person who is trying to think, solve a problem, plan, create, whatever it might be. And then there's the issue of what are they thinking about? And there's a lot of different aspects to that, different kinds of challenges that people have that we'll go into in a minute. And then the question is, how do we approach these types of questions? I like quotes a lot because it summarizes some very good wisdom by people that are very successful and smart and experienced. And I like this one about the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. And you can read the whole thing, but basically Einstein is actually paraphrasing a quote from Goethe, who said something to the effect that reason is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. And this is basically a paraphrase of that. And I've lost my controls again for some reason. Okay. Sorry about that. So again, in trying to approach this as a reasonable person, which is, again, my fiction that I try to pretend that I'm a reasonable person, I go and I look around on the web and in books that I have to try to get some perspective on this. And this is actually a quote that I had used in a trade study course that I developed at Lockheed Martin Space Systems back in 2004. Be your reader for this. It'd be too boring if I did that. But the idea is that there's a single ultimate objective in doing something that's strategic. And we'll talk about measures of effectiveness and a hierarchy of measures of effectiveness. And Clausewitz is talking about there being a single ultimate objective, which is, in his case, something like winning the battle or winning the war for what it is that he's about. So we'll discuss a number of the aspects of thinking in a formal sense. And I think that these are very important ones. I've selected some that are kind of the highlight of this. Measures of effectiveness are extremely important, and I'll refer you to some notes on measures of effectiveness that I wrote when I was a professor in the Operations Research Department at the Naval Postgraduate School, and that these are being taught at the Naval Academy, in fact, since then, in the mid-'80s, is my understanding. Another important aspect is system definition. What is it you're talking about? What's inside the system? What's outside the system? And then what is a strategic thinking process? When I developed the trade study course at Lockheed Martin Space Systems, while I was in the Advanced Technology Center, I thought, again, going back to basics, how can I think about this in a way that I can organize this, have organizing principles so that I can hang the details of it and direct people's attention to the various stages of doing trade study thinking. And so I'm extrapolating that to strategic thinking process. I don't claim to know what that is, but I think that this is a good way to organize some of the discussion and possibly organizing some of the activities in actually trying to do strategic thinking. And then there are methods and there are tools. So when I developed that trade study course, I thought a good way to break it apart was in terms of a process. Could be a checklist, could be a diagram, what have you. Keeps you on track, could be iterative. And then various methods that are applied with the aid of supporting tools. And then that seemed to go over pretty well. Anyway, I want to see how this is consistent with how we really think. And by that, I mean conscious and unconscious. And so in my research about strategic thinking, I found some interesting discussion from von Clausewitz, which was really right along the lines at which we've been discussing in this forum, and also along the lines that I'd been thinking for a long time, which is that von Clausewitz is described as being a Hegelian thinker. Hegel was a very famous philosopher, and the most famous phrase associated with him, I believe, is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And this is what the Taoists would call the Tai Chi, that things consist of opposites, and that dialectical thinking includes both extremes. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. So he stressed the dialectical interaction of diverse factors, meaning a thing is not just one polarity or the other polarity, that one needs to be able to deal with the apparent paradoxes and contradictions. And having the right mental stance to deal with this, you're not necessarily going to be completely boggled when things don't turn out the way you expect, and you can then be agile and respond to things because you have, in fact, considered both extremes, both the thesis and the antithesis, and hopefully you've come up with a strategy that incorporates both of them. And you can tune that when you're actually in a stressful situation like war or the combat among political opponents or business, etc. Okay, again, following along, taking a look at what Wikipedia has to say about strategic thinking, I had some comments about that. Number one thing that we've been discussing in these forums, in these webinars, is that there really is no generally accepted definition for strategic thinking. And it's a relief to see that Wikipedia says the same thing, and people are very careful not to claim to know exactly what that is or how to do it, but there are some guideposts. And again, in the Wikipedia article that I found, they describe some of the major attributes of strategic thinking, and I think it's good to focus on these and see how they are applied in some of the examples that we'll discuss shortly. Number one, a systems perspective, meaning that they're trying to do holistic thinking, thinking of the entire problem, not microscopic looking inside each black box, but putting things together in a reasonable architecture and defining what's inside the system and what's outside the system is very, very important, systems thinking. Intent focused is basically that they describe there that you're more determined and less distractible. I characterize this as the function of the will. Famous story about Alexander the Great when he was conquering the world and he went into the city-state of Gordia. They told him that he had to be able to be smart enough to unravel ridiculously complicated knot. And what he did was took out his sword and he cut the Gordian knot. So it's a very famous paradigm of how do you react when perhaps you're overwhelmed or perhaps you don't agree with the premises. And so I think that this intent focused has to do with the function of the will in coming up with a strategic plan. Thinking in time means that you can hold both the past, present, and future in your mind at the same time, which is pretty clear. Hypothesis driven, again, these are the words from Wikipedia. It means that both creative and critical thinking are incorporated into the strategy making. And so these are thought to be complementary aspects of thinking. Again, something that we've been discussing in these webinars. Intelligent opportunism. I interpret that to mean agile. I mean, you pay attention to what's going on in the real world. You may have your plans. You may have your thoughts as to how you're going to proceed. But then when you find out that there's an opportunity or a danger, you can respond very, very quickly. To these that are mentioned in Wikipedia, I would add the following one, that you're comfortable with dialectical, Hegelian, yin-yang, Tai Chi thinking. Lao Tzu made it very famous in the Tao Te Ching. Taoism, Eastern Asians understand this way of thinking very well. This is a good time to point out that I went to a Military Operations Research Society conference in Annapolis back in 2006. And one of the talks was about how the East Asians, how China specifically, thinks based on Taoism and Confucianism. And it's very important for us in the West to understand that there are different ways of thinking. Not everybody thinks the way we do. And people have different preferences, ecological preferences, cultural backgrounds that determine how they think about things. And this idea of dialectical thinking is based on a book that I have read that is very well thought of, I think, by Richard Nisbett, Nisbett. I have that included in the references. And Nisbett talks about the difference between East and West in thinking. And one of the Art of Thinking books that I have actually compares some other studies where they've determined that East Asians are simply do more dialectical thinking than we do. And sometimes that's an advantage. So this is one of those things that is very important, that we understand that this is a very important aspect of any kind of thinking, particularly of dialectical thinking, has to do with the way the world is on the outside, also has to do with the way the world is in our minds. So let me back up a little bit and talk about some thinking that is part of my vocation that I've had some experience with, and try to dissect them in some fashion to get an idea of what is strategic thinking, why these examples are not strategic thinking, if we can determine that, and give an idea of a process that I've used in some of these. So the first one is solving physics problems. I taught physics, college physics, for University of Maryland in Okinawa back in 1983. And I came up with a process that turned out to be very useful. And I'll describe that in a minute. The creative thinking, there's a very famous 4 stages of creative thinking. And the process is preparation. You work very hard to prepare the ground. You study, you think. You're consciously putting in a lot of effort. There's an incubation period. And typically the incubation period is you're in the bath, you're in the shower, you're sleeping, you're dreaming, whatever it might be. And then as a result of turning the problem over to your unconscious, you have a period of illumination, hopefully, and you get some ideas, and then you verify that they are, in fact, reasonable ideas, because sometimes they're not. And there's a very interesting book that I read a long time ago by Hadamard, who's a very famous mathematician, about the psychology of invention in the mathematical field. He describes a large number of examples where people have discovered very important things based on, you might interpret it as, their unconscious presents them with the solution. So 2 examples that I want to just describe very, very briefly, because I think they're very interesting, is the discovery of the benzene ring. So the chemist who was trying to understand the properties of the chemical benzene was totally stumped, couldn't figure it out, had done all the preparation, and in a dream, he saw snakes representing the benzene molecule. And the snakes moved around and slithered around. And eventually, the snakes bit their own tail. And he woke up with that eureka moment, realizing that the benzene molecule was a ring. Okay, that's one example. Came to him in a dream. Another one, another very interesting one that's described in that book is how the sewing machine was invented. The person who was trying to invent an automatic machine to sew, again, was stumped. The natural thing is to think that you put the thread through the tail of the needle. And he fell asleep and dreamed that he was captured by some Aborigines in Africa, and they were going to cook him or something like that. And he noticed that they had pointy heads and they had holes in their heads. And he woke up with that eureka moment that he should have the thread go through the head, the pointy part of the needle, not the tail. And that was apparently very important. Okay, another one that I want to discuss, again, somewhat briefly, but where I've actually developed a process, methods, and tools, a way of thinking about it that proved very successful in a trade study course that I developed that I'll describe in a few minutes. And then finally, the fourth example is strategic thinking. You know, what kinds of issues arise with trying to understand strategic thinking, what's required of it, how we do it, how we can teach it, and whatever characteristics there are in these other types of problem solving and creativity and critical thinking. The question is, what needs to be added to this? More will, more cutting the Gordian knot, vision, personality, intuition, more holistic thinking, more executive ability to see what the essential features are, and prune the data so that they don't overwhelm you. What is it? So let me go on to the best. Again, this quote is very famous from Eisenhower. And the quote that from von Moltke, that no plan survives contact with the enemy. I mean, you better be agile. You better have the options and the landscape organized in your mind and in your intuition in such a way that you can react and respond in an appropriate manner. Because whatever it is that the plan's wrong. It's going to disappear. And Eisenhower said that very famously also. So let me describe my teaching physics in Okinawa. This will be real quick. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, I taught physics, first-year physics in Okinawa for University of Maryland. I had an idea, which was a kind of epiphany that I actually had when I was an undergraduate taking my first course in physics in college. And let me just tell you that very quickly. I was a very good student in physics. My Ph.D.s in physics, loved physics, like eating candy to me, frankly. Goes back till I was very, very young, interest in science. And here I was in the final exam in my first course in college physics, and I came across a problem that I could not solve. It boggled my mind. Like most of these problems, they're described in words, and I was confused. I didn't know how to deal with it. And here's where the will comes in, I think, the part that's really important in solving problems is that I just said, okay, I don't know how to do it. I'm totally boggled by this. What can I do? I can start transforming this problem into symbols and equations. And I simply approached it, which is, I think, probably any reasonable person would. I just started writing down what I could. I transformed the verbal problem into equations and diagrams. And I wrote down the physical laws that I thought might have something to do with it. And basically, it solved itself. And that was my first epiphany about this. So when I was teaching these college students in Okinawa, I thought the most valuable thing that I can teach is how to think, in fact, how I think when solving physics problems. So what I did was I never tried to solve the problems or looked at them very carefully before the class because I wanted to see the students see me, watch me fumble around with it. And I would verbalize that as I stood in front of the class with a blackboard. And the students, of course, always asked about the most difficult problems. And I can tell you that I sweat a lot at various times. But what I would do is I would verbalize my thoughts in the process. And one thing that I said was don't get wrapped around the axle. Don't try to hold the problem in your head necessarily, because that simply stops you from proceeding to do the transformation into symbols and equations and diagrams. And so that's what I would do. I would say, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just doing the first step. I'm transforming this from a verbal problem, a word problem, into symbols and diagrams and equations, and trying to figure out what physical laws apply to this. And of course, that part's very easy because it's whatever was covered in that chapter. And sometimes I wouldn't know how to proceed for a bit, and so I would talk it out. This process always worked. It never failed, even though I sweat a lot when I was doing this. And the students seemed to appreciate it. And it seemed to me that it was certainly more interesting to everybody to watch the professor sweating in front of the class. So these were the steps that I just mentioned, okay? The process was as I described, okay, process with a capital P. The methods were those of physics and math and calculus and algebra, etc., applying those methods to that, within that process. And the only tool that I used was really the chalk and the blackboard. In this case, I didn't need a calculator. I didn't need anything else. Well, maybe I did need a calculator, but I don't remember. But basically, as I said, it seemed as if the problem solved itself because I had a process that definitely worked. When I was in graduate school, going along the same path, a different wrinkle on this was the problems, of course, were much harder problems. And when I got stuck, I would say, and I'm not sure where I came up with this, but I highly recommend it. I would say, what if I were Einstein? How would I approach this? And that always worked to get me unstuck. And that's actually, I found very recently that there are studies that have shown that something called priming of the subjects, putting certain thoughts or impressions in their mind before they're asked to perform a certain activity, actually modifies the outcome of what they do, helps them to solve problems better, or inhibits them from solving the problem, depending on the environment and the words that they were that were spoken to them and the pictures that they were shown. So this priming really does work. And I think that me asking myself, what if I were Einstein, and pretending I was Einstein, definitely worked. There's no question about it. Now, all of the above, all of this is not strategic thinking, I believe. Okay, this is a fairly simple series of processes, or series of steps, I should say, in a process.
Ed, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
You want to take some questions at that point?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely,
sure.
Delighted to.
Let's see if anyone has some questions, and I'll open up the mics. And I'll probably have to go one at a time, though, I suspect, to see. Just hold on one second. Daniel, do you hear me? Do you have any questions for Dr. Rockower at this point? Why was that not strategic thinking, that kind of thing? Daniel?
I'm just listening in. Everything makes sense so far.
Okay. Thank you. Gene Bellinger, how about you, sir? Gene?
I'm good to go.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Cantonian, do you have any questions for Dr. Rockower at this point?
Not yet. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
John Drury, any questions, sir?
Hi, Dr. Rockower. It's nice to meet you, sir.
Nice meeting you.
In terms of the concept of strategic thinking, and maybe this is not a question, so forgive me, but I always think about the difficulty of, okay, if I have a certain knack for solving a problem, and I know that, and I'm self-aware of that, but I can't put it into terms, kind of like Einstein's imagination is more important than knowledge. Something begins with an idea that you really can't explain why you think it, but then you set about to prove it. And the way it seems that you prove it sometimes is by not using, first of all, you want to be able to transfer knowledge at some point in time, transfer a formula or an ability, a process to another generation or to a classroom. And part of that process is described in strategic thinking, and it's a process of imagination. But then you have to turn that into, like you said, I believe, trying to turn that into some real world parameters without really tying them down all that hard. In other words, part of the scientific approach is to not be too scientific about it. And if you have a concept of what I'm trying to futilely say here, could you comment on that for me? Because what I'm trying to, one of the things that I've been trying to discern in working on a thesis is how I can take something that is intuitive that we ask analysts to do all the time, but when we discuss it in terms of a kind of a scientific approach, then we say it's impossible to do. And there has to be some bridge between those two. And
right.
if
Totally
you would, sir, comment on that, please.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. So one of the things that I think is very important is to avoid premature closure and to use the appropriate language when addressing different aspects of thinking and proof. So it's true that some concepts are seemingly paradoxical or seemingly can't be expressed well. And that has to do with some of the modes of thinking that people have. If it's assumed that you have to have logical left brain thinking as the final arbiter of what it is you do, then you're definitely not doing strategic thinking. So one of the things that I talk about later in this slide deck is the relationship between the will, the conscious, and the unconscious. And I think it's important that a strategic thinker or any thinker has a certain kind of a relationship with their unconscious and knows what to take and what not to take, because your unconscious can also mess you up. So you have to be very careful about that. So I distinguish these three things: the will, the conscious, and the unconscious, and the relationship of those three things. And so when you're talking about things where you intuit something, but it's hard to describe, it simply means that there's some more work to be done, or a little bit more discussion, or perhaps you don't have the right people sitting around the table with the right ways of thinking about it. One of the things I mentioned in a following slide is Edward de Bono is one of the gurus of thinking, one of the demigods, I would say, written a lot of books. He's the one who coined the term lateral thinking. And he has a technique called 6 hats, where the idea is that each person will put on a different colored hat. And based on the coloring of that hat, you can only do critical thinking, or only creative thinking, or only judgmental thinking, or I forget exactly what they all are, but it's a fairly well-known technique. And he says, and I quote him later also, that many of the methods of thinking are simply direction of your attention to different aspects. Mm-hmm. And so being comfortable with those things that seem paradoxical is important. And I don't know if I've answered your question. I think I might have danced around it a little bit. But yeah, I totally believe that you can see things and know things without being able to express them. I've been in that boat many times. And it's a question of kind of understanding what's happening and then investigating it very carefully, and then seeing whether or not it really is just a daydream or whether there's something really there. I don't know that I can say much more about that. I hope that was in the right direction of what you were referring to.
Yes, sir. Well, in fact, the process of strategic thinking has to incorporate imaginative thinking all along the way.
Right.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I do agree, and I think that each one of these types of thinking requires creativity and vision and will, and dealing with your unconscious and nonverbal reasoning. I think they all deal with it. It's a question of degree. And so it's important that people feel comfortable in a diversity of ways of thinking and that they tolerate it in themselves and don't censor themselves or, heaven forfend, other people. It's very important. So it's a matter of degree. The previous example when I was talking about Okinawa, certainly I had images forming in my head when I was trying to solve the problems, and I was trying to be creative in the way that I expressed them. But the system was very simple. So from the system definition was really simple. The measure of effectiveness was very simple. There was no opposing force other than my own ignorance. So it doesn't get classified as strategic thinking because it doesn't have those other very complicating fog of war types of aspects to them. But again, they have a lot of the different types of thinking going along with that.
Okay, let me go on to the next person there. Okay. Nancy, welcome aboard. Do you have any questions for Dr. Rockower? Nancy? Okay.
I am here, but listening only for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here too, by the way.
Yes, thank you.
Trudy, do you have any comments, ma'am?
No, I'm fine. Thank you very much. It's very clear and I'm enjoying it.
Thank you. Glad you're here. General Hall, do you have any comments for Dr. Rockower?
Yes. First of all, Clausewitz, I agree, is absolutely chock full of references to holistic thinking. He talked about the interaction of defense and offense, the engagement, battle, and campaign. His famous Trinity of War is very interactive and holistic. And then on page 77 in the book that Ed mentioned, he talks about war, however, is not the action of a living force upon lifeless mass. Total resistance would be no war at all, but always involves the collision of two living forces. So, a person who is thinking in a strategic realm certainly has to think about this interaction of opposites, the offense and defense, and it takes two people to tangle, so to speak. The other, I have a question, a couple of questions. One, you mentioned end, the word end, in one of your slides. And to my way of thinking, a holistic, strategic type of thinker has to realize there's not an end to anything. There are states of continuity that lead off into the future. And when you said that the past, present, and future are all connected, then it implies to me and causes me to infer that there is no end state. And when people use the word end or end state, it gets confusing because they aren't thinking about what's next and what are the relationships and possible outcomes as opposed to one end. Comment, please.
Yes. So I think it was the quote from Clausewitz where he talks about there being one end and that all the factors have to come together in that. I addressed this issue in discussing a hierarchy of measures of effectiveness, and perhaps there's no end to those. And so a lot of times the thinking may be not strategic because the person is dealing with too low a level of measures of effectiveness, not looking at the meta issues and the hierarchy of measures of effectiveness. So whenever someone decides what is it you're trying to achieve, then I agree with you. This obviously there's always more. Once you get there, you're top of that mountain, you see the next mountain that you have to climb. So there's always a hierarchy of measures of effectiveness, and time is kind of a living thing that it continues. Once you get there, it's not the end of the chapter. I mean, it may be the end of the chapter, but it's not the end of the book, hopefully. And again, thinking of it in terms of measures of effectiveness as you approach strategic thinking, I think implies that you should always be looking for what the higher level measures of effectiveness or what the next stage is, what the next steps are as you go through a strategy, as you actually execute the strategy.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Another thing for the entire audience, is the word or the two words strategic thinking seem to be confusing to anybody because, what exactly is strategic thinking? And is it thinking about strategy? Does that connote then tactical, operational, strategic? Does it connote that a holistic thinker, a strategic thinker has to think at corporate level, goals and objectives and have a real strategy to get there? Did you find strategic thinking to be ambiguous and confusing, Ed?
I think that the best way to describe that is that I'm inspired by Colonel Mickleby, who basically said he doesn't want to describe what strategic thinking is. It's not that clear. And the Wikipedia quote that I gave earlier about what is strategic thinking, that there's no clearly defined definition of that. What constitutes strategic thinking, and I'm properly, I have a proper level of humility about that. I would not want to be the one asked to describe definitively what strategic thinking is. So that's why I'm trying to look at it from different approaches. So one of my personal processes is always to take a question and try to hold it outside of myself and look at it from different directions and try to avoid premature closure. And so that's what this whole briefing is about, in fact. Is to try to look at it from different directions and get some dialogue going. And I know that there are people in the audience today who have vastly more experience in strategic thinking than I do. Looking at my entire career, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to really point to my experiences of strategic thinking, which I think I'm not the person who's done that. And I've not had specific training of that, and I know that is trained in various places. So I would respectfully beg off on that. I want to think about it, but I don't want to be the one to try to define it.
Well, maybe we could, say that, just flip the words. It should be thinking strategically. And that then implies that people have to have certain thinking skills to be able to think strategically. For example, holistic type of thinking, holism, and dealing with wholes, could help us, as we move forward.
Right.
But listening and thinking about it was just a bit, I think that maybe that we need to clean that up, Tim, and flip it around a bit, to help people a little more, be a little more specific about what it is that we're trying to think about.
I think you're right. That's a very good point, Mike. Thank you. Thinking strategically is turning the words around and looking at it from a different perspective, as Ed has suggested on all these things, is very appropriate here.
Yeah, and what those characteristics are in thinking strategically, I think I like the summary that I found in Wikipedia that I described in a previous slide. And with the addition, I think it's sorely lacking definition, actually. I think that not taking into consideration dialectic, or what I call yin-yang or Tai Chi thinking, Hegelian thinking, not taking that into consideration is a serious lack. And the fact that that's not in the list on that Wikipedia, and that I suggested it should be added to that list, is an important consideration. And it'll help us to a great extent in dealing with East Asians who are raised in a culture that emphasizes the context and the polarities. And yes, so I think that I like that list, actually, because it includes, systems thinking, which is holistic thinking. I think it includes a lot of the aspects that are important.
Well, let's bring in,
I interpret it as the will.
Let's bring in Gene Bellinger. He's a systems thinker. He has a thought to offer in this regard too.
Par excellence.
I spent decades being confused about strategy and tactics. So I threw the words away. So if you just for a moment, imagine that you're looking at a very large organization chart on the wall that's multiple levels deep. And if I take the top level and I put the word what on the top level, the next level down from that is how. So that what I intend to accomplish is defined at the top level, and all of the next level down are the pieces that I undertake to accomplish that what. Though at that end of that next level down, that how is actually a what for the next level down, so that it's recursive in definition depending upon where you are and which direction you're looking. So that if you're standing anywhere looking up, it defines what you're attempting to do, and looking down says how you're going to go about doing it. So I don't talk about strategy and tactics anymore. I just talk about what and how.
Very good. Thank you. Ed, you want to continue on, please?
Sure. Okay, so now we come to my perspective as a practitioner, more of a real professional level experience that I think I've alluded to earlier. So I take a pragmatic approach, and I was asked by the Director of Systems Engineering at Lockheed Martin Space Systems to develop a trade study course. And I think everybody here probably knows trade studies means decision analysis, trade-off analysis in the aerospace and automotive industries, maybe other places also. So in trying to sort out what I could put into a course and what the taxonomy, what the details were, I came up with this idea so that I wouldn't be too confused, and hopefully the students would have hooks in their brains to hang the different details when we went through it. So I broke up trade studies. In fact, I defined the name of it as trade studies, process, methods, and tools. And in my experience, in many discussions, people often confuse the differences between models and methods and tools and process and all the rest of it. So this was my attempt to try to make this a little more clear. So here's a process, a chain of events, could be a checklist. The methods are things that you know, might be laws of physics, engineering principles, things of that sort. The supporting tools, this is my Swiss Army knife, represents the chalk that you hold in your hand, or an Excel spreadsheet, or a very specialized statistics set of tools or programs. Could be something like SPSS or R or something of that nature. Could be some other simulations that incorporate the methods that are used in a certain place in the process. And I developed this in 2004 and taught it about 10 or 12 times. And it was very well received, led to me being selected at the corporate level as the technical lead for a systems engineering analysis fundamentals course. And as part of this endeavor, I interviewed a lot of the high-level managers, technical leads at Lockheed Martin Space Systems on some of the major programs, and asked them about how they thought of analysis, how they thought about this. And so I contributed to changing what's called the command media, like how you do these things, how you think about these things. And then after that, helped to develop this systems engineering analysis fundamentals course for Lockheed Martin Corporate. So this is just give you a flavor of it. First, I wanted to define a process, and this is what I came up with. You know, some of these are very obvious things, but again, having them spelled out and recognizing that this whole process could be iterative, and the order in which things might appear could be different is not important. The parts that I'm focusing on today is the system definition and the measures of effectiveness, and the fact that there is a chain of events, of activities that you have when you're doing a trade study, and a lot of other kinds of decision analysis. But again, I would say this is not strategic thinking. This is not necessarily strategic thinking, but obviously it requires creativity, some agility as you find that things aren't as you thought they were, and can be very, very multidisciplinary. I should also mention that when I finished my Ph.D. in physics, I already knew that I wanted to do very multidisciplinary things, and so I was hired on the original F-16 program in the operations research section. So I was doing trade studies on, back in the mid-'70s on the F-16 program. And so I have some background in this, and I thought this was a reasonable way of characterizing it. And Leonardo is always a good guy to quote. Okay, everything's connected to everything else. You need to study the science of art and the art of science. I think that's a great, great quote. It means that you need to have a diversity of ways of thinking about things. Anyway, this is the process that I came up with that incorporates some methods and tools. I emphasize measures of effectiveness, which is, in some sense, how well are we accomplishing what we're setting out to accomplish, knowing that it could be iterative. And there's a lot of different aspects to it. And so there are sub-measures. And so distinguishing between measures of performance and various levels of measures of effectiveness is extremely important. This is supposed to represent desirability curves because these are all, they may be judgmental, they may be specified as have to have at least this amount of one characteristic, you can't have greater than this amount of cost, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just a flavor of that. This is part of the tasks going through that. I mentioned the hierarchy of measures of effectiveness, and down at the lowest level of the pyramid of measures of effectiveness, and this is looking at the point of view of creating a system for accomplishing something in a campaign, in a military context. You do trade-offs at this lowest level. They're usually very quantifiable, and engineering principles can be used. There may be a lot of precision and a fair amount of accuracy, and there may be a high level of fidelity of the models. Okay, this is subsystem requirements. As you go up the hierarchy, you get to the point where the measure of effectiveness is being successful in the campaign, or minimizing casualties, or maximizing the amount of casualties on the opposing side, or making the most money if you were looking at from a business context, or from a social context, saving the environment, decreasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere based on all the lower levels of activity. So at this highest level, it may be, because of the nature of the challenge here, it's very uncertain. There's a lot less fidelity in the models, in the data. It may well be much more strategic. You've got actual other people who are opposing you. You need to be more willful. You need to be strong to deal with the frustrations and failures and the fog of war, et cetera, et cetera. So I would guess that things might be a lot more strategic up at this higher level. If this was put together specifically for trade study, but the same kind of hierarchy would apply, or similar hierarchy might apply. Again, this brings us to the diversity of thinking. You need a team. You need a lot of different people who are involved in a trade study. If it's a major trade-off analysis, a major decision. Yeah.
Doctor, may I interrupt for just 1 second, please?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to the previous slide for one moment.
Okay.
If you don't mind. Okay. Daniel Bissell, let me call up him for just one moment. He had a question concerning that particular slide. Daniel?
Do you know of any computer, what you're showing on your slides?
I can't hear him.
Daniel, we're having difficulty hearing you, sir. I'll read your question.
Go ahead.
He posted over in the question block on the side, do you know of any computer models support this? He's heard of theory of inventive problem solving. Presenters describe programs that support this, and he doesn't know of any links. You know of anything that might help him out in that regard?
Regarding the hierarchy of measures of effectiveness?
Yes.
The only thing that I can say in that direction is not a specific model, but I mentioned that. Well, I was teaching combat models and games in the OR department at the Naval Postgraduate School in the mid-'80s, And we didn't have a handout for measures of effectiveness, so I wrote one. And if you go to rockower.net, you'll find a link to my notes on measures of effectiveness. And they start from the ground up, basically. And my understanding is they've been taught at the Naval Academy since then, and also included in the Naval Operations Analysis book, 3rd edition. And so that's the only thing that I could specifically refer you to right now.
Okay. If anyone has questions, you can post it over in the comment block too, by the way. Post it in the comment block, or you can raise a flag and let me know, and I'll try to get to you as we go along, because I want to be able to address any questions or concerns as Dr. Rockower progresses through his presentation.
Now, there are programs. I didn't mean to imply that there are not programs that help you to organize your thinking about this. And I actually used one at Lockheed Martin back in 2002. And I do not remember the name of it. And we had purchased some licenses for something that helps you to set up trade studies, analyses, operations analysis, in fact. I don't remember the name of the particular program, but I think that there are that help you to identify or organize the data. So I would definitely look around for that, because I think that they're probably still around.
Okay. Daniel, I hope that answered your question. Let's move forward, please.
Okay. So the higher level trade studies, I'm assuming, would need more leadership, wisdom, vision, more intangibles, more judgmental aspects. And if you have a live opponent, it may be that that's part of what would characterize it as more a strategic trade study. But again, I'm assuming that this is not, the trade studies are not specifically strategic thinking, that they're made in design of systems or trade-off and looking at different tactics. Analysis could have to do with operations analysis, where you're trading off different aspects of different plans of various sorts. Anyway, my first mentor at General Dynamics, when I was working on the F-16 program, taught me this. He said that there are two kinds of people. There's technique-oriented people, and there's problem-oriented people. I just see that obviously I'm not a spelling-oriented person. And you want to be a problem-oriented person. You don't want to be limited by the techniques. And so strategic thinking is absolutely going to be problem-oriented. Again, I put this here just to indicate and to address the fact that terminology is not consistent as to what people are referring to when they talk about models and algorithms and tools and methods, etc. So I would caution everyone to be very careful about this. Again, this goes back to when I was interviewing over a dozen of the top level people in charge of very large programs at Lockheed Martin. And it was clear that when people refer to a model or they refer to an analytic technique or a tool, that there was no consistency, and most of the people that I interviewed in that regard said, this is really important. Thank you for doing this. It's important to try to clarify what we're talking about. So here I'm talking about, here's a model, and that could be a tool, really. People refer to that sometimes as a model. There might be some theoretical model on how you do things. Subject matter experts kind of help to inform that. Numerical analysts, statisticians, scientific programmers deal with helping to create a tool or a program. Programmers implement many of those things, whether or not they're scientific programmers. There are algorithms that are used for the actual theoretical model, and there's also algorithms that are used for basically computer science types of techniques, like sorting and searching within a large database, for instance. And then there's optimization algorithms that can be applied. So there's a lot of different techniques of thinking and tools for thinking, and it can be very, very formalized. It's a left brain conscious kind of a process for developing those methods and tools within your process. And it's very easy to get hung up on that and get confused by the terminology. That's always a problem when standard English words are hijacked into very specific scientific or engineering contexts, that there can be some ambiguity or a lot of ambiguity. So now I want to change course here, and I want to talk more about who's doing the thinking, about the person who's doing the thinking, and the type of thinking that a human being does. So I want to address that now. And there's a lot of different ways of looking at this, and I put down the ones that occurred to me. There's left brain thinking versus right brain thinking. So right brain is feelings and pattern recognition and artistic and creative is the way it's thought of. Left brain is thought of as being more adult and more logical, linear thinking. When I have taught, sometimes depending on the course, I will actually give my standard disclaimer at the beginning of the class. I'll say I'm a very right brain person, and you should have confidence I know what I'm doing, but I'm going to get my arms around the whole subject. I'm going to go all the way around the topic and then fill in the details later, because I care about the landscape and the relationship of the different segments and pieces to each other more than I care about the specific techniques and the details that I'm going to put inside that map. So I'll try to tell you what the landscape is and get an idea of what's going to be there before I put those in. I'm not going to go through this in a linear fashion. I don't like going through things in a linear fashion because I am a right brain kind of person. Okay, I can do left brain things. Obviously, I'm a Ph.D. theoretical physicist, but psychologically, where I live is with intuition and my feeling about things. And all of my left brain thinking is to inform the right brain. And many people can say the same or similar sorts of things, but there are differences in the psychological preferences of people. Another distinction is between microscopic analysis and black boxes, the kind of thing I learned getting a PhD in physics, really, as opposed to the meta or macro synthesis of a system architecture, systems thinking, etc., which I really learned when I worked on the F-16 program. And it was really a catharsis to change my perspective, instead of looking inside the black boxes, but to see how all the different black boxes fit together. And that was a major growth for myself, for me, and it definitely took me out of my comfort zone at that time. Then there's conscious as opposed to unconscious thinking. And this is extremely important that everybody understand that however you think that you are thinking, it's really much more mysterious. We don't even want to confront it ourselves typically. The unconscious is way faster than the conscious mind, is the part that does pattern recognition and provides ideas and thoughts. When I open my mouth, I don't have in my conscious mind exactly what I'm going to say. These slides here are cueing me in, but I'm actually, my conscious mind is clearly going into my unconscious and bringing up these thoughts. There's logical versus intuitive. And then if you ever read any books on meditation, the monkey mind is our mind jumping around, being fascinated. You know, Google makes it even a lot worse, playing video games probably, as opposed to being mindful. Being mindful meaning just not identifying with your thoughts, but looking at them in a more objective way, in a non-judgmental way. These are important to understand how your mind works. And then there's organized, compulsive, focused, controlled, as opposed to daydreaming, relaxed. And the great famous example of that is Archimedes in his bath figured something out, you know, how to determine if the king was being cheated on the gold that was used in his crown, and ran down the streets naked shouting Eureka. So the kind of thinking when you're being creative, you can also characterize as fuzzy thinking. And by fuzzy thinking, I do not mean sloppy thinking. I don't mean sloppy thinking. It means being open to possibilities. And there's a quote that I like a lot. There's a Nobel Prize winning physicist named I.I. Rabi, R-A-B-I. And when a reporter asked him, you know, to what did he owe his great success in physics? Why was it that he was able to accomplish so much? Rabi said, it's my ability to maintain fuzzy thinking for longer than others. So he was specifically trying to be creative and specifically trying to generate ideas and not, and I guess I would call this avoiding premature closure. And then the final thing, which I think that we in the West are somewhat lacking in, and that's not just my opinion. That's things I have read in one of the books on the art of thinking, and another book by Richard Nisbet on the way that Westerners and Asians think differently. That we are the inheritors of the Aristotle's A or not A. That a thing either is something or it's not something. This is the law of the excluded middle. And that, Aristotle has a tremendous influence on Western culture. On the other hand, East Asian cultures are heavily influenced by the Tao Te Ching, by Taoism and Confucianism, where part of the culture is specifically to look at both extremes and know that all real reality has to consist of the integration of those two. So I should have put in a Tai Chi symbol here. But the Tai Chi is basically that there are two polarities for everything. And one thing that I have been saying is that all wisdom is the integration of opposites. There are many quotes to the effect that that wisdom is always paradoxical, that the real truth is always paradoxical. And again, we have plenty of smart people in the West too. Hegel said that, and there's a lot of others that have said similar things, but they have not caught on. They're not as much a part of our culture. Here's the quote that I alluded to earlier that I said Einstein had actually changed it slightly. The mind or reason is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. It's very important to understand who's in control. One thing that I've said is a person who has to be logical all the time, I would call that one definition of insanity.
Dr. Rockower, I've got one comment from Gene Bell before you jump off that thinking slide. Sure. And he says, if all wisdom is the integration of opposites, then what might be the integration of strategy and tactics?
A good plan, I guess. I don't know. So the implication is that those are opposites. And I don't know if that's right. I think that if I were to distinguish between tactics and strategy, I don't know that I would say that they were opposites, but I'm not the authority. Again, I would demur. I would beg off of that question. But I'm not sure that those are the opposites.
Right. Let's ask General Hall what he has to think about that.
Well, you're missing one element too, and that's the tactics and the engagement, battle, and campaign, and tactics and strategy. Tactics are the means in which a strategy is accomplished. So they're not opposite to my way of thinking. They're complementary that operate in the same whole. And I think that we have to think of that as being totally related. And yes, they do come together. First of all, in the concept of operation that stems from the leader or decision maker's vision. And then there are tasks that go out, but they're all relative to what it is that the leader is after with the strategy. So I think these things are very, very relative. And when you read Clausewitz, it helps me to understand. He thinks that everything is connected on a battlefield. And he very much a holistic type of thinker. And I think that's what one of the skills that we have to have as we're thinking about this. The other thing, please think about is what we're really talking about here is conflict. And when you have conflict, you have a person who's trying to impose their will on another person who's resisting, and vice versa. And so those are really opposites, but they're totally enmeshed with one another. And how it comes out isn't necessarily the number of bombs that you drop or the quantifiable things that you can count, but it's the things that are more intangible. And so pretty soon you understand that struggle is part tangible and intangible. So when you're in measures of effectiveness, for example, you have to be extremely careful because pretty soon you get wrapped up like we did in Vietnam with counting bodies and counting tons of bombs when the real problem was the will which is intangible, and measures of effectiveness do not work well quantifiably with things like will, emotion, hatred, retribution, all the things that make up humanism and struggles. Okay.
Jane, is that sufficient for an answer for you?
My thought was that the integration of the two of them is engagement.
Say that again, please.
My thought was that the integration of the two of them is engagement.
Engagement, okay. Okay.
Well, the engagement has to lead to something, doesn't it?
Well, my understanding was that the strategy was what it was that you were endeavoring to accomplish.
Yes, and then the tactics is going to lead you into accomplishing that or not accomplishing it.
Right. And I thought I heard a comment saying that they were pretty much woven together. That you having one without the other is, sort of meaningless.
Yes. I mean, if you had a strategy with no means to execute your strategy to achieve the goals, then you would never get anywhere. But if you have just tactics, go out there and maneuver around, for example, in the military with no end, no goal, no state of continuity in mind, then that's empty too. So you need to have the two interacting. You can't do one without the other.
Good.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Dr. Rockower, would you like to continue? I think we've got about an hour and 10 minutes or so into this already. Do you want to kind of wrap it up, and then we'll do this again on the next time, find a good closing point for you?
Okay, sure. So this is an important slide, I think, that my recommendation would be that it's important that people understand the characteristics on that previous slide, the different aspects of how they think, whether they know it or not. It's important that people be comfortable with it, understanding, so that they understand where their own mind is going when they're trying to think strategically. Here's a quote from a book that I recommend, Thinking Fast and Slow. This is written by Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And basically, the thinking fast is the unconscious mind. And I've seen estimates of anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 times as fast as the conscious mind. And apparently, the unconscious mind is much larger, has much more capability than the conscious mind. And the slow thinking is the conscious mind. And he basically says that the secret author of many of your choices and judgments is really your unconscious. And that's the one that really is making the decisions very often. So knowing that is really important. This quote from Sigmund Freud, I think, is, again, very important, who basically is saying that if something's really important, it's a vital matter, then decisions should come from your unconscious, from deep inside yourself. Anyway, that's important for people to understand and deal with it, and understand that their unconscious can also mess them up at times. So there's a number of slides I have. I've got about 5 more slides, but maybe this is a good time to end this. Because the rest of it is about psychological and some of these aspects that have to do with how we really think internally. And that's a very subjective topic, as I said. So maybe this is a good time to stop and we can continue another time.
Yes, it would be great. What we can do is continue this at the next date that we have set aside for you on either the 1st or the 3rd.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Weekend in the month, and invite everyone to come back in. If you have any questions at this point, though, I'd like to just throw open the floor. If anyone has a comment or a suggestion or a question, this is the time to do it, because we'll go into more depth, a little bit greater discussion the next time Dr. Rockower comes on board. And he's here with us pretty much all the time, and has been thus far. I appreciate that. So let me open the floor up to some comments if anyone wants to do so. Just raise a flag or comment somewhere. Let me talk with Daniel Bissell really quickly. Daniel?
I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Yes. Now? Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think this is all really good from a theoretical perspective. I would like to see the people who are participating connect in a Google group or some ongoing conversation where we can begin to apply the ideas in a tactical perspective. In your opening comments, you talked about having a focus area in terms of applying all of this. And I think we each have different focus areas. So if we could gather online in between these sessions, maybe we can do a lot to apply the ideas.
Okay, I think, yes, I think what I'll do then is just create a Google space for you to be able to do that, carry on a discussion on that's separate from this. That'd be great, Daniel. I'll have to look into how to do it, though, but you may know more than me in that regard, because I'm on a really steep learning curve here. I'm trying to figure all this out. Very good point, though. Thank you. Gene, any further comments there?
No, I'm good to go.
Thank you. Ake, any other comments there?
No, so thank you. I mean, thank you for the presentation. If we continue, I might have some comments or questions, but that's fine now. So thank you for the presentation.
Yes, sir. Glad you're here. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's go to John Drury. John?
Enjoyed the presentation, and thank you. You might also consider a LinkedIn group.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Nancy? Would you like to add something to the discussion, or you? Hello? Okay. And let's close out with General Hall.
I think that the number one skill that we need the most to be able to do the kind of thinking that we're talking about is called synthesis. And it interacts with analysis in a whole. And but what we're good at, we being Americans, the Western world, what Ed has been talking about, is we're very good at analysis, we're very good at quantification, but we're not as good as taking that which we've analyzed or broken apart into small pieces and understanding and having the imagination and creativity and synthesizing those pieces into a larger and greater and better whole. And the skill of synthesis, in my experience, is very difficult to teach. Many people, absolutely just aren't real good at it. So the good manager, good leader has to know, his or her people, and what are they good at? Are they good at analysis, or are they good at synthesis, or can they then team those two together? And a lot of times there's a lot of friction between the two because their mindsets are just different. But in the end of the day, you get a much more creative way of doing things if you can get those two types of people to think better. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us as thought leaders, for everybody that we work with or who works for us or who we work for, to help them one way or another to learn this wonderful, beautiful, joyous skill that it just opens up this wonderful world for everybody, which is called synthesis. That, if you can work on that and get people thinking that way, then they can get into the things that Ed has been talking about with more of the Eastern way of viewing the world. And not saying that either one is the best. I'm much more inclined to do the synthesis than I am the analysis, but I know I need people to do the analysis for me. And that would be my advice, but I haven't come up with good ways of doing that over 40 some years of trying, hit and miss, but I'm hoping that during the discussions we have that we can hear from you on how you approach that problem and helping others learn how to think that way. That's all.
Thank you, General Hall, and Dr. Rockower, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make at this point?
Just following on what Mike just said, it just, occurs to me that the most surprising thing and the most important aspect of that Wikipedia quote that I put in, where they were talking about the different aspects of strategic thinking, was they did not include that synthesis. They didn't include the yin and yang, the Hegelian dialectic. It was not in their list, and that's why I said that I would recommend adding that. That may be one of the most important things to address, to make sure that people are being educated about those things, and that they understand that it may not be as important in our culture historically, but it needs to become much more important to learn that dialectic, Hegelian, yin-yang kinds of thinking, and that everything consists of the integration of the opposites, that it's not just A or not A, as Aristotle would have us believe.
If you'd like more information about the topics discussed today, please contact me at tim@global-connectivity-research.org. Remember to read critically, think critically, and go lead enthusiastically.